They ridiculed her scars and gave her to the Beast King. He bowed before his fated mate. The horn cut through the morning, before Alara Wren had time to set her water bucket down, and she felt it in her chest before she heard it with her ears. She was standing in the backyard of her Aunt Agnes's house, with both hands around the bucket handle, when the sound rolled over the rooftops of Ashvale. Long, low, heavy with a kind of authority that did not need to announce itself, because it already knew it was being heard. She had heard that sound once before, when she was a small child, young enough to press between the legs of a market crowd and watch things from below. Back then the herald had announced a change in the grain tax. People had argued about it for 3 weeks, and then returned to their ordinary lives. This time was different. She knew that before she had consciously identified what she knew it from. Something in the specific weight of the note told her, or something in herself that had been waiting for a reason to leave, finally recognized one. She set the bucket down. Water spilled over the rim and darkened the dry autumn dirt at her feet. She did not look at it. She looked at the back door of the house. Her Aunt Agnes appeared in the doorway in less than a minute. Agnes was 50 years old, with gray at her temples, and the compact, practical manner of a woman who had made difficult decisions for a long time without assistance, and had stopped expecting assistance. She stood in the doorway with her shawl already around her shoulders, which meant she had already been to the front of the house, to look before Alara had even registered the sound. Agnes looked at Alara. Something moved between them that had no words. Then Agnes said, simply, "Go inside," and turned back into the kitchen. Alara went inside. She stood at the main room window, where a gap in the shutter slats gave her a view of the village square without requiring her to be in it. She had spent considerable portions of her life at this window for exactly that reason. Being in the square of Ashvale required a particular kind of energy, the energy of managing the attention that followed her wherever she went in this village, and sometimes observing from the inside was simply the more efficient choice. The herald rode into the square on a dark horse, with the king's banner rising on a pole behind his saddle. The banner was black and deep gold and moved with the heaviness of something that was not performing ceremony, but was simply being it. 2 armored soldiers followed at a distance, and stopped when he stopped, and looked at nothing. They had done this in many villages. Their faces communicated that they would do it in many more. People gathered fast. 600 people lived in Ashvale, and the ordinary events of an ordinary month could be predicted completely by anyone who had lived there for more than 2 years. A herald with the king's banner was not an ordinary event. The square filled with the particular density of a crowd that has been given something unexpected to respond to, and has not yet decided what the response should be. Alara watched and named faces through the shutter gap. Old Martin from the mill, whose hands were always red and large from the grain work, and who had a habit of saying things about Alara's family that he believed she could not hear from the distances at which he said them. Donna Hartley from the bakery, who had been crossing to the far side of any road that Alara walked on for 3 years now, with a consistency that was more exhausting to maintain than it was to receive. The Crane girls at the outer edge of the crowd, 16 and 17, who had absorbed the attitudes of their parents with the thoroughness of children who do not yet know they have a choice about absorption. The men by the market wall, the women in their clusters with folded arms. The herald cleared his throat and read. His voice was trained for open-air crowds and carried well. He said that King Aldrich of Valethorn, by royal authority, required each settlement in the territory to provide 1 unmarried woman of suitable age for service at the royal court. The local council would manage the selection. The selected woman was to be delivered to a designated gathering point 14 days from today. Non-compliance would be addressed as outlined in the attached written decree, which he was now presenting to the head of the village council. He held out the rolled document. George Bale, head of the council by virtue of owning the most productive farmland in the area, accepted it with both hands, and a face that was carefully holding nothing. The herald rode away without waiting for questions. The crowd did not disperse. It contracted inward on itself, turning into a mass of simultaneous conversations, with the particular energy of a community that has been given a problem, and is in the process of each member of it, ensuring that the problem is solved for them personally, before anyone else can solve it for themselves. Alara watched this through the gap in the shutter, with the clear-eyed attention she had always brought to the behavior of the village, which was the attention of someone who had spent 22 years studying it, from a remove that she had not chosen, but had learned to use. She already knew what was going to happen. She had known it from the first note of the horn. She moved from the window and sat at the kitchen table. The table was old pine and had a crack running through the left corner that had been there for as long as she could remember, and that had never been repaired. She had eaten every meal of her life at this table, and she had never once done so without being aware of the slight but consistent gap between herself and the rest of the household. A gap too small to be named, but too steady to be missed. It was the gap between being given shelter and being welcomed. She had lived inside that distinction for 22 years. Agnes came back inside about 20 minutes later. She hung her shawl. She moved to the stove and touched the lid of the pot without doing anything to what was inside it. She turned around. She said that Bethany's engagement to the Hartley boy had been formally announced to the council last week, which made Bethany exempt. She said that Alara's other cousin was 14 and too young to be considered. She said that this left the village with no practical option. Alara said that she knew. Agnes looked at the space just beside Alara's face rather than at her face directly, which was how Agnes almost always looked at her. She said that Alara had no binding arrangements in Ashvale, no trade that anyone depended on, no family situation that required her presence. She said it the way she said most things, plainly and without decoration, as statements of fact that she had verified and found accurate. Alara said that she was right. Agnes gave one brief nod. Decision acknowledged. She turned back to the stove. Alara sat at the cracked table for a while and listened to the village returning to its normal sounds through the kitchen window. Metal from the direction of the blacksmith. A dog somewhere near the market lane. The voices of mothers and fathers working out their versions of the problem in tones that were urgent but not distressed. The tones of people who had resources to bring to a problem and were in the process of bringing them. Every family in Ashvale with a daughter of suitable age was currently doing this. Calling in favors, announcing arrangements that had been pending, finding the specific combination of existing obligations and new commitments that would keep their particular daughter at home. Nobody was doing this for Alara. There was nobody to do it. She went to her room. It was a small room at the back of the house, with a narrow bed and a shelf of 7 books above it. The books she had collected over years, through small trades and saved coins, and 2 anonymous gifts left on the doorstep, which she had always believed were from the schoolteacher, who had quietly supported her education for a decade. The window looked over the backyard and the fence and the long field beyond, and at the edge of the field, the trees. She had been looking at those trees from this window her entire life. She stood in front of the small mirror on the wall beside the door. It was warped at one edge, so what it showed was never quite accurate. She had learned to account for the distortion automatically. She looked at herself. The scars began below her left ear and spread across her jaw and neck and stopped at her collarbone. Silver white, raised, permanent. They were the first thing every person looked at when she entered any room, and she knew this with the same calm certainty that she knew her own name, because she had been watching it happen since she was old enough to read expressions. She had been 4 years old when the fire took her parents and left its mark on her. She did not remember the fire itself, only the smell of its aftermath, which lived in her memory as something between gray and purple, and the sound of water being poured somewhere, and cold ground, and then a stranger's arms, and then Agnes, and then this house, and this room, and this life. The village had made many decisions about Alara over the 22 years she had lived in it. She had learned which decisions were worth spending energy on, and which were simply the weather. What she had not learned, and had given up trying to learn, was how to stop wanting something more. Not more in the external sense, more in the sense of a place where she was seen accurately, instead of through the filter of what had been decided before she was old enough to form an opinion about any of it. She turned from the mirror and began to pack. She was methodical. 2 dresses, her warm shawl, the bundle of dried herbs she kept for practical purposes, the 7 books wrapped carefully in the extra dress so they would not knock together, the small coin pouch with what she had saved over years of work, her mother's silver ring at the very bottom of the bag, wrapped in a piece of clean cloth because it was the only thing she had that had belonged to someone who had loved her, and it deserved careful treatment. She was nearly finished when movement at the window caught her attention. A fox was sitting at the far end of the fence line, in the shadow of the fence post where the fence met the edge of the field. It was a large fox, several winters old, with the dense fur and the deliberate stillness of an animal that had learned to make careful assessments before committing to any position. It was turned toward her window, watching. with the amber certainty of a creature that had arrived at exactly the place it intended to be. She opened the window. The cold morning air came in. The fox did not move. She rested her arms on the sill. She looked at the fox. The fox looked at her. This had been happening her entire life. She had stopped trying to explain it a long time ago. Wild animals came to her, not in the way they came to patient and gentle people in general, but specifically and directly, as if something in them recognized something in her that was relevant to them, in a way that nothing else in the landscape was. The hawk that had descended from the sky when she was 12 and landed on her outstretched arm. The deer that had followed her for a mile along the forest path. The wolf that had sat outside her window for 3 nights once. She felt what these animals felt. Not in words, because animals did not have words, but in the direct, specific way of one organism understanding the internal state of another before the mind has time to process it. She felt their fear, and their calm, and their pain, and their hunger, and their alertness. And she had learned over 22 years that what she felt from them was almost always accurate. What she felt from the fox, sitting in the shadow of the fence post watching her window, was something she did not have a name for. Not calm, not fear. Something more like recognition. Something that was looking at her and finding what it was looking for. She held still. The fox held still. After several minutes, the fox stood, turned with the liquid efficiency of foxes, and disappeared into the long grass at the field edge. She watched the grass settle back to stillness. Then she closed the window and finished packing. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed with her packed bag beside her and read until the light through the window was entirely gone. Then she lay back in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about King Aldrich of Valethorn. She had heard the stories. Everyone in the territory had heard them. They moved with travelers and merchants, gathered and embellished at every way station, passed from village to village with the particular quality of information about powerful people that makes it always slightly more than the facts and slightly less than reliable. She had heard that the king was not entirely human. She had heard that something lived in him that came out under certain conditions, and that the conditions involved the full moon and the night. She had heard that his eyes caught light in a way that ordinary eyes did not. She had heard that women sent to his court did not come back, though this she filed in the category of possible exaggeration, because she had never met anyone who could provide a specific name attached to a specific verified absence. She thought about all of this with the same practical honesty she brought to everything she could not control. The stories might be accurate, or they might not be. She was going regardless. The going was settled. What she was going toward was entirely unknown. Unknown had never frightened her the way it frightened most people. She had grown up in a place where everything about her had been decided before she was old enough to contest any of it. Unknown meant that nobody had decided yet. Unknown meant that whatever happened next would be determined by what actually occurred, rather than by the accumulated weight of habit and judgment and assumption that Ashvale had been pressing down on her for 22 years. She would take unknown over that every time. Underneath the practical calm of her thinking, something warm and alert lived. She did not name it. She had learned not to name things until she understood them properly. She noted it and let it be there. She slept. She woke before the sky was light. She washed her face and braided her hair with the particular care she always brought to her braid, which was the one daily act she had always done for herself and nobody else, and the consistency of it on this morning was a comfort. She ate porridge at the cracked table across from Agnes, who looked at the stove throughout. She stood. She picked up her bag. She said goodbye. Agnes nodded at the stove. The morning came in cold and clean and smelling of pine and frost when she opened the door. She stepped through it. She walked through Ashvale for the last time in the early morning, with the bag over her shoulder, and her chin level, and her pace even, past the mill, past the bakery where Donna Hartley was already in the doorway, who watched her pass, and swept the same spot on the step 3 times in a row, without appearing to notice she was doing so. Past the square, past the school, past the well, past everything that had been her world for 22 years, and that had never quite managed to be her home. At the top of the north lane the road bent into the trees. The village disappeared behind her in a dozen steps. The trees were tall and old and the morning light came through them in separate moving pieces that shifted with the wind. Somewhere above her a bird she had never heard from the village side of the tree line was doing something extraordinary with its voice. The road ahead was entirely unknown. She walked into it without looking back. The carriage arrived at the gathering point before dawn on the 14th day, driven by a man who said nothing, and driven by 2 guards on horseback who said less than that. The morning was the kind of cold that settles into the bones and stays, not the clean cold of early autumn, but the committed cold of late October, when the season has made up its mind. Alara climbed into the carriage with her bag, and found 2 women already inside. The first was named Cora. She was about 30, with red hair, and the careful stillness of someone using every available internal resource to contain a feeling too large to be expressed in a moving carriage. She sat with her arms wrapped around herself, and her eyes on the oil-soaked window cover, and said nothing for the first 3 hours of the journey, and Alara understood immediately that she was not being unfriendly, but was simply occupied. The second was Nell, who was 19, and had apparently decided that the most survivable response to being collected by the king's guard and transported north toward a castle, about which extremely unsettling stories were told, was to fill every available moment of silence with the sound of her own voice. She talked about her village, and her mother, and the baker she had nearly been engaged to, about the quality of her village's midsummer festival, and the specific flavor of a soup she remembered from a feast 3 years ago, and the various opinions she held about different styles of embroidery, and the size of the capital city, as described by someone who had once met a soldier who had been there. She talked with the specific energy of a person who is not actually talking about any of the things she is thinking about, and Alara listened without interrupting, because she recognized this strategy from its inside, and understood what useful purpose it was serving. The farmland fell away behind them on the first morning. Gentle hills became steeper ones, and the forest began gradually. A few trees at the road's edge that became more trees, and then became the forest proper. Old trees. Trees that had been there long enough to have developed opinions about space, and had expressed those opinions by growing wide rather than just tall, their roots surfacing across the road surface in long irregular ridges that the carriage wheels bumped over one by one. The light changed inside the carriage as the canopy closed above the road, arriving in separate moving pieces rather than as the continuous flow of open country. The smell changed too. Alara noticed this through the gap at the edge of the window cover. The air that had smelled of fields and turned earth now smelled of something older and deeper, the specific richness of large trees and old growth and forest floor that had been accumulating itself for centuries without interruption. It was a smell she had always responded to, had always found settling in the specific way that places respond to you when you are the kind of person those places are designed for. She was watching the forest through the window gap when she saw the wolf. It was standing in the space between 2 enormous oaks, turned toward the road, watching the passing carriage with the absolute stillness of an animal that had arrived at a position and had no reason to move from it. It was ash gray, and large, and built low through the chest and shoulder, in the way of animals that have been built for weather and distance rather than speed. It was not threatening, it was not afraid, it was simply there, watching, and when the carriage moved past the gap between the oaks and the wolf came into full alignment with the window, its eyes caught the light from the canopy above for 1 second, and held it in the amber, burning way of something that was not reflecting light, but producing it. Alara held very still at the window. The wolf was behind them. She sat back. Nell was explaining something about a relative. Cora had her eyes closed. Whether sleeping or simply preferring the dark behind her lids, Alara could not tell. She thought about the wolf. The way it had stood, the quality of its watching, which was the watching of an animal that had come to a specific place for a specific reason, not the watching of an animal that happened to be near the road. She thought about the fox in the yard on the last morning in Ashvale. She thought about the amber of the wolf's eyes in the canopy light. She filed this, and did not examine it further, and watched the forest go by. They stopped for the night, at a stone way station, set back from the road, maintained by a woman who asks no questions, and provided bread, and a hot, thick soup, and 3 narrow cots in one room. The fire in the main room had been going since morning, and had the developed, settled heat of a fire that has earned its warmth. Alara ate, and sat near the fire, after the other 2 women had gone to their cots, and she listened to the forest outside the thick stone walls, doing what old forests do at night. She had always been able to hear forests, not in the way of someone who noticed sounds and identified their sources, though she did that too, but in the deeper way of someone for whom the forest at night was a comprehensible language, layered and specific. Wind through different levels of canopy produced different tones. The movement of large things through undergrowth had a different quality from the movement of small things. The calls of hunting birds were different from the calls of resting ones. She lay these layers over each other and assembled from them a picture of what was happening in the dark outside the walls, and the picture told her that the forest was going about its business with the thoroughness and the total indifference to human opinion that forests always went about their business, which she found more comforting than troubling. She slept in the chair by the fire, deeply and without waking. The second day's road was longer and narrower. The forest had become the kind of forest that Alara had read about in the history books she had collected over years but had not seen, the kind that had been there before there were roads through it, and would be there after the roads were gone. Old growth with a canopy so high and close-fitted that the sky was completely invisible for long stretches. The cold was serious now, coming in around the seams of the carriage, with the committed persistence of weather that has made up its mind. Nell had mostly expended her supply of conversational material by mid-morning of the second day, and was operating on shorter bursts, leaving actual silences between them that each woman occupied in her own way. Cora spoke for the first time at some length at around noon. She said she had a daughter, 4 years old, left with her younger sister. She said it simply, and without drama, the way people state things that are too large to embroider. Then she was quiet. Alara said, after a moment, that the daughter would be waiting for her. Cora looked at her. It was the first time she had looked directly at Alara rather than through or past her. Alara said that a 4-year-old girl, who had very specific ideas about how she wanted things done, would have very specific ideas about how she wanted her mother to come back, and that those ideas would keep her occupied. Something in Cora's face shifted. Not ease, not quite, more like acknowledgement. She looked back at the window, but the rigid, braced set of her shoulders had changed by a small but real degree. They rode in a more companionable silence after that. The trees thinned without warning in the middle of the afternoon, giving way to a wide valley floor of dark grass, and Alara pressed close to the window gap and looked out. The castle. She had formed ideas about what it would look like, based on descriptions she had read and heard. Every one of those ideas was insufficient. Valethorn did not look like something that had been built. It looked like something that had grown, the way mountains grow, through the accumulation of enormous pressure over a very long time. The stone was dark, the same dark as the mountain behind it, and in many places the line between the mountain and the castle was not visible at all, as if the building and the rock had made an agreement about their respective territories and were now jointly the same thing. Towers rose in irregular arrangements, some very tall and narrow, some broad and low, all of them built at different periods by people with different ideas about what the castle needed to be. Ivy had covered the entire western face, rooted so deep into the mortar that the wall had incorporated the roots as part of its structure. The whole thing, in the late afternoon light with clouds moving behind the upper towers, had the quality of something permanent in the deepest sense, something that had been there long enough that the land had simply accepted it as one of its features. Nell made a sound that was not quite a word. Cora pressed her lips together and said nothing. Alara looked at it for the whole time the valley approach lasted, until the carriage passed through the outer gate, and the castle was around them, rather than in front of them. The inner courtyard was large and busy with the ordinary afternoon activity of a large household. No one stopped what they were doing when the carriage arrived. This too communicated something. She stepped out of the carriage into the courtyard and straightened her back and looked up at the castle. To her left, at a comfortable observing distance near the inner wall, a group of 20 court members had arranged themselves with the casual purposefulness of people who had come specifically to observe something and preferred not to look like it. Most of them were well dressed. Several of them had the specifically polished look of people who spent significant time on their appearance and considered this a reasonable investment. The attention from this group moved to the arriving women and then settled on Alara, in the particular way that attention had been settling on her since she was old enough to be in public spaces. She recognized the mechanics of it. She stood in the courtyard and looked at the castle and did not perform anything in response to the attention, neither defiance nor apology, which were the two performances that had always been expected of her, and which she had always declined to give. The head chamberlain came forward. He was thin with silver-streaked hair and the settled, reliable manner of someone who had managed large households through many different circumstances for many years. He read from a list. He assigned Nell to the East Wing guest chambers, and Cora to the adjacent room with a smooth and practiced efficiency. When he reached Alara's name, there was a pause, brief enough to be deniable, but present enough to be understood, and he assigned her to the servants' corridor on the west side of the castle. She followed the house servant sent to take her there. The room at the end of the servants' corridor was clean and cold. Narrow bed, a hook on the wall, a window that showed her a section of the castle's inner secondary wall, and the upper third of a large pine tree growing in the yard below. No fireplace. Stone floor that held the cold the way old stone holds everything it takes in, permanently, and without reconsideration. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed with her bag beside her, and looked at the window. She had spent 22 years in Ashvale, being given the room at the back of the house. She understood the room at the back of the house. She understood what it said about her value in the estimation of whoever had assigned it, and she understood that this estimation was wrong, and she had decided a long time ago that living her life in accordance with incorrect estimations of her value was not an efficient use of the time available to her. She unpacked what she needed. She read by the small oil lamp until it needed trimming. She turned it down and lay in the dark. The castle was large and full of its own night sounds, stone contracting in the cold, wind finding the gaps in old frames, the distant, organized work of a kitchen that did not stop. She lay and assembled these sounds into a map of the building, the way she always assembled new spaces from their sounds, locating herself within the architecture, from what she could hear. She was doing this when the sound from below the window came, breathing, from the inner yard below, slow and deep and large, in a way that did not fit any ordinary source. She sat up. She crossed to the window in the dark, and looked down into the yard. The yard was in shadow. The pine tree was a dark mass. Nothing moved. And then at the base of the pine tree, at the very edge of the shadow, 2 amber points of light appeared. Steady, looking up, looking at her window with the patient, complete attention of something that had come to a specific place for a specific reason, and was in no hurry. She placed her hand against the cold glass. The amber lights remained. 10 seconds. 20. Then they were simply gone, not moving away but ceasing, the way eyes cease when they close or turn. She stood at the window for a long time after. The yard was empty and dark. The pine tree was a pine tree. Her heart was not racing. She examined this specifically, the way she examined things that surprised her. Her heart was steady. The amber in the dark below her window had not produced fear in her. What it had produced was something that lived much closer to recognition than to fear, the specific feeling of having been seen accurately by something that was looking for exactly what it found. She went back to bed. She lay in the dark and thought about amber eyes below a dark window and what she had felt from them, which was the thing she felt from animals that had come to her with intention, not threat, not need, something older than either of those, something closer to the thing the fox at the fence had shown her, and the wolf in the road between the oaks. She closed her eyes. Whatever was here, whatever was looking up at her window from the shadow of the pine tree, was asking a question. She fell asleep thinking about what the question was. The first week in Valethorn was an education in the many ways a person can be made to feel unwanted without anyone doing anything that could be formally named. Alara had 22 years of experience with this, and had long since developed a reliable taxonomy of its techniques. The most common was the door allowed to close a half-second before you reached it, timed with the specific precision that made it indistinguishable from an accident, unless you had seen it happen too many times to accept that explanation. The second was the seat that happened to be occupied by the time you arrived at it, despite having been empty when you entered the room. The third was the conversation that found its natural conclusion in the same moment you entered the space where it was being held, leaving nothing to join. The fourth was the eyes that made their assessment of your face and moved on so quickly that the looking almost disguised itself. Almost, but not quite. The court of Valethorn was practiced at all 4 of these, and several variations that Alara had not previously encountered, which she filed in her taxonomy, under novel approaches, and examined with a detached professional interest that was easier to maintain here than it had ever been in Ashvale, because in Ashvale, she had known everyone doing these things, and in Valethorn she did not, which meant it was easier to observe, without the additional weight of personal history. She also knew that the thing to do about it was nothing specific, not pushing, which produced resistance, not retreating, which produced the confirmation that the exclusion worked. simply occupying the space that was available, doing what was real inside it, and letting the architecture of the exclusion define itself through what it actually was, which in her experience was almost always mostly habit and the social cowardice of people who do not want to be the first to break an arrangement that no one has explicitly made, but that everyone has tacitly agreed to. The exception came on the morning of her third day. She was trying to find the linen storage, because finding the linen storage was the kind of practical problem she could solve independently, and solving practical problems independently was how she moved through spaces that were not yet organized around her presence. The linen storage in Valethorn Castle was not where it should logically have been, which she had established by trying the 3 locations where it should logically have been, and finding other things in all of them. She was standing in the corridor outside the 4th option when the young woman came around the corner with her arms full of folded cloth and her face arranged in the expression of someone who has organized a task badly and is aware of this. The young woman stopped. She looked at Alara. She looked at the door Alara was standing outside of. "Are you looking for the linen storage?" she said. "Yes," Alara said. "It is in the most unreasonable location in this entire building," the young woman said, with the feeling of someone who has been wanting to say this to someone for a while. "Follow me." Her name was Iris. She was perhaps 20, with a round, open face, and the particular practical directness of someone whose days were fully occupied with actual tasks, and who had not had time or inclination to learn the elaborate social indirections that the rest of the court had apparently been studying since childhood. She showed Alara where the linen storage was, and also, in the next 10 minutes, where the secondary supply corridor was, and how the lamp oil system worked, and which staircases locked from the inside after dark, and which did not, and who to see about the persistent cold draft in the west corridor that had apparently been discussed and not resolved for 6 weeks. Then she had to go deliver the linens. She left with the brisk purpose of someone who had completed a task and was moving to the next one. Alara stood in the corridor and thought that Iris was the most genuinely useful person she had met in Valethorn so far, and would likely remain so for some time. On the morning of the 5th day she found the stables. She had been exploring the working passages of the castle, the routes connecting the outbuildings to the main structure, that were used by the staff going about the practical business of maintaining a large household. These routes were quieter than the public corridors, and more direct, and told her more accurate things about how the castle actually functioned. She found the stable passage through the east outer building connection, and pushed through the heavy side door into the long stone structure that ran along the east wall. The smell hit her before her eyes adjusted to the lower light. Warm horses and clean hay, and well-kept leather. The honest smell of large animals living their animal lives with no particular concern for what any person thought about it. Something in her went immediately quiet, the specific, absolute quiet of a person who has arrived in the right place. She stood for a moment and let that quiet settle. The central aisle ran the full length of the stable. Stalls on both sides, most occupied. The horses turned their heads as she entered, the curious ones and the indifferent ones, and the 2 at the far end who were half asleep with their lower lips hanging loose, already committed to whatever internal experience they were having. At the center of the building, different from the others, was a stall with additional timber reinforcement on the walls and a door secured with 2 heavy iron bolts. The horse inside was a dark bay mare. She was not particularly tall, but was built with substance through the chest and shoulder that spoke of opinions. She was standing in the center of her stall, with her body at an angle, weight forward, the whites of her eyes visible at the corners, nostrils spread wide. Her ears were in constant motion, forward and back, and forward again. The walls of her stall showed the marks of previous contact with a distressed horse. She had not been groomed. Nobody had been close enough. What Alara noticed, the thing that was more significant than any of these other things, was that the mare was facing the door, not the back of the stall, not the corner, the door. She was facing Alara. Pete appeared from the far end of the stable. He was a broad man with a reddish beard, who moved with the economy of someone who had spent years in the company of large animals, and had learned that efficient movement and no wasted gestures were the price of keeping all the parts you were born with. He told Alara, with direct professionalism and without unfriendliness, that the reinforced stall was not for visiting. The mare had arrived 2 weeks ago from the north, with good papers and good breeding, and had thrown 2 experienced handlers on her first day, and had not allowed anyone near her since. She would be moved on if she could not be worked with. The king did not maintain horses that nobody could manage. Alara was looking at the mare while Pete spoke. The mare had not looked away. She reached for the lower bolt. Pete said her name, not sharply, with the quality of someone stating an important fact. She reached for the upper bolt. She drew it back. Pete moved back without saying anything further, which was the response of a professional who has recognized that something is happening and has decided that his best contribution is not to interrupt it. She opened the door, not wide, just enough to stand in the gap without stepping through. She stood there with her hand on the door frame and her shoulder in the opening, and she looked at the mare, and she did not speak, and she did not move, and she did not perform anything. The mare's breathing was loud, her ears pinned back, and her weight shifted forward, and the first 2 seconds looked like they were going to end in the specific and painful way that Pete had been anticipating. But they did not. The mare held her position. She looked at the woman in the doorway. Something in her was going through a process that was slower than aggression and more considered. Alara breathed. Slow in, complete, all the way to the bottom of her lungs. Slow out, long and unhurried. She had been doing this near frightened animals since she was old enough to understand that her own internal state communicated to them across whatever distance separated them, and that the communication was specific enough to be worth managing. She found the part of herself that was already still, the part she had always had, and that nothing had managed to reach in 22 years, and she let it be the whole of her, breathing in the doorway of the reinforced stall. She felt the mare's state. She felt the fear behind the aggression, the specific fear of an animal that has been moved from its known context into an unknown one, and has been alone in that unknown context for 2 weeks, with no one who could reach her. She felt the exhaustion under the fear, because sustained high alertness is exhausting even for a horse. She felt the thing underneath both of those, the thing that the mare was facing toward the door for, the thing that had kept her front-facing when she could have turned her back on the whole situation. Something in the mare was still looking for something, still expecting that the right thing would eventually arrive. The mare took 1 step toward the door, then another. She stopped when her nose was less than a hand's width from Alara's shoulder. She breathed out, a long breath, into the space between them. Alara did not move. She let the breath arrive. She let the closeness of the mare's face to her neck be exactly what it was, which was the mare making a decision about whether this was safe, and she communicated through every part of her stillness that the decision could take as long as it needed to. It took 11 minutes, which she counted, not to track the time, but to give herself a point of focus that kept her breathing even. At the end of 11 minutes, the mare's nose was resting against the side of Alara's neck, just below the line of her scars, and the breathing was long and slow, and the whites of the eyes had disappeared. The mare's ears were forward and resting. Her weight was balanced over all 4 feet. Pete had not moved from his position at the far side of the aisle. His arms were loose at his sides. His face was doing something complicated. "What would you call her?" Alara asked, without moving. Pete thought about it. "She came with a name I do not think she likes," he said. "What name would fit what she actually is?" Alara said. Pete was quiet for a moment. "Something about what she is going toward, rather than what she is right now," he said, slowly, feeling his way toward it. "Yes," Alara said. He thought about it for another moment. "Calm," he said. She liked that. She could feel the mare breathing against her neck, slow and regular. "Calm," she said. The mare exhaled again, longer this time. She came back every morning after that. Calm greeted her at the stall door on the 3rd morning, and by the end of the 2nd week was carrying Alara in the paddock on a long rein, with the relaxed, forward energy of a horse that has decided the current situation is acceptable. The story moved through the castle in the way that things move through castles, which is faster than any deliberate communication, and more completely. She was aware of it moving because she could feel the quality of the court's attention toward her shift, not to warmth, which would have been too much to expect, but from the settled certainty of indifference to a more active and uncertain thing. She had been evaluated and found to be something outside the category she had been placed in, and the court was in the process of deciding what to do with that. On the morning of the 7th day, she was working calm on a long rope in the paddock when she turned to check the sun and found the king standing at the outer fence. She had seen him twice from a distance. The impression she had formed was of a very tall man who moved with deliberate, grounded certainty through whatever space he occupied, and who changed the proportions of rooms simply by being in them. In person, at 15 feet, the impression became a specific fact. He was exactly as tall as she had thought. He wore dark clothes without ornamentation. His face at rest was the face of someone who had trained it to give nothing away, and who had been doing so long enough that the trained expression had become the natural one, so that what you were looking at was a face that contained a great deal and showed none of it. His hair was dark and slightly longer than the fashion the rest of the court wore, and his eyes, which she had heard described many times, and which she had seen from her window in the dark, and which she recognized now as belonging to what had been watching her from below the pine tree, were amber, deep and burning, catching the light in a way that was not reflection. He was looking at calm. After a moment he said, without looking at Alara, "How do you do it?" "I feel what they feel," she said. She thought about how to be accurate, and when I feel what they feel, I can let them know that the feeling is going to change, not by telling them, by being the thing that is already on the other side of it. He looked at her then, briefly and completely, the way he appeared to look at everything he considered worth looking at. Then he walked to the paddock gate, unlatched it, and came inside. He walked directly toward Calm. Calm raised her head, and her ears came forward, and her weight shifted to her hindquarters. He stopped at exactly the right distance, which Alara noticed. He held out his hand, palm up, and went completely still. Calm looked at the hand. She stretched her neck forward, step by cautious step, and put her nose to his palm. He closed his eyes. He stood like that for a long moment, and Calm's head dropped and her weight distributed evenly again. And when he opened his eyes, he looked across the paddock at Alara, with something in his expression that she recognized, because she had felt it herself many times. The specific surprised quality of discovering that a part of yourself works differently than you had assumed. "You feel it too," she said. It came out as a statement. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, simply. He walked out of the paddock and across the yard, and did not look back, and she stood in the paddock with Calm, and watched him go, and thought about what that yes had contained, which was considerably more than its single syllable suggested. That evening, Iris appeared at the servants' corridor room door, with her eyes at a noticeably different diameter from their usual. She delivered, in a carefully level voice, the message from the head chamberlain Morris, East Wing, 2nd floor, guest quarters, fireplace and a window facing the forest. Alara sat on the edge of the narrow bed for a moment after Iris left. She looked at the room around her, the hook on the wall, the view of the inner wall and the top of the pine tree, the cold stone floor. She picked up her bag and began to pack. The East Wing room was large and warm and had a window that faced north and west, and in the mornings, the light came through it at an angle that moved slowly across the ceiling as the clouds shifted outside, a pale and living gold that changed from one minute to the next. Alara had taken to lying still for a few minutes each morning just watching it. She had not had a morning habit like this in Ashvale. There had been nothing in Ashvale to be still for. She used the writing desk before the castle woke fully. She had kept a notebook since she was 12, filling it with the honest version of whatever was happening around her, the kind of writing that had no audience and therefore no reason to manage what it said. What she wrote in the first mornings at the East Wing desk was a record of the gap between what she had expected Valethorn to be and what it was turning out to be, which was large enough and interesting enough to occupy several pages. What she had expected, a place organized entirely around the management of its king, cold and formal and maintained at a careful distance from anything real, run by people who had perfected the art of performing loyalty to something they were afraid of. What she was finding, something more complicated and more specific than that. Real skill among the people who did the actual work of the castle, real loyalty of the personal kind among certain of the staff, the kind that comes from knowing someone's actual nature rather than their title. Iris, who was the most useful person she had encountered in years. Pete, who loved his horses with a plain and consistent devotion that she recognized and respected. Owen Drake, the chief advisor, who she had not yet spoken to at any length, but who moved through the castle with the quality of attention of someone who was actually paying attention to all of it, which was different from the court's attention, which was paying attention to whatever affected the court's own position. And the king, who was not what the stories had made him, or not entirely, or not in the ways that mattered when you were in a room with him. The court's reaction to her new quarters developed over the first week, with the predictable mechanics of a social system encountering a development that did not fit its current arrangements. The reaction was not outrage or overt hostility, because the court was too practiced for that. It was the subtler, more durable thing, the recalibration of existing systems to account for a new variable, while not acknowledging that a new variable had arrived. Helen was the one who spoke to her first. Helen was the wife of a senior military advisor, a woman in her mid-40s, with excellent posture, and the kind of composure that had been maintained for so long, it had become entirely genuine, rather than performed. She appeared in the corridor outside the main hall, with the mild surprise of someone who had definitely not been positioned near the side door waiting, and said that she had heard Ilara had settled into the east wing. Ilara said that the window was very good. Helen considered this for a moment. She gave the smile that occupied her mouth without reaching her eyes, and said that was wonderful, and continued on her way. Ilara continued to the library. The library was the room she returned to most reliably, because it required the least social management. People in libraries had purposes, and people with purposes were not interested in adjacent people. She had found a corner in the west alcoves, where the shelves were tall and close together, and the window gave consistent afternoon light, and the foot traffic past her chair was minimal, and she had been spending part of every day there working through the castle's collection, which was extensive, and had been accumulated by many different people across many generations, with no unified approach to what should be included, which meant it was comprehensive, in the specific way that comprehensive things are, when nobody is in charge of the comprehensiveness. She was reading an account of the Eastern Territory's river systems and tributaries, working through the physical geography before attempting to understand the political one, when she heard footsteps that were different from the library's usual traffic. She did not look up immediately. She read another sentence, then she looked up. King Aldrich was at the far end of her row of shelves, scanning spines with the focused attention of someone looking for a specific thing. He moved along the shelf, found it, pulled a slim volume out. He turned to leave. His eyes reached her. A moment passed. He looked at the book open on the table in front of her. The Eastern Tributaries section, he said. Geography first, she said. I find the politics make more sense when I understand the physical shape of what the politics is happening inside of. Something moved across his face. Brief. The specific expression of someone who has just heard their own approach to something described by another person. He looked at the chair across the table from her for a moment. Then he pulled it out and sat down, and opened his own book and read. They did not speak again for over an hour. They read in the same quiet, and what the quiet was not the awkward quiet of two strangers occupying a shared space, but something more settled than that. Something that had no obligation in it, and no performance. Just two people in a room with books, doing what people in rooms with books do when they happen to be the kind of people who can share silence without needing to fill it. When he left, he gave her a brief look and was gone. She sat for a moment after he had left, and thought about what had just happened. Not the event itself, which was straightforward. The quality of it. She had spent 22 years in Ashevale, never once experiencing the feeling of being in a room with someone, and having the room's quality improve because that person was in it. She had experienced rooms becoming harder to navigate, rooms becoming easier to leave, rooms requiring more management. She had not experienced a room becoming more like what a room should be. She thought about this, and then she went back to her book. At dinner that evening, her place card had been moved. 6 seats from the head of the table on the right side. Not near the king, but not at the far end beside the kitchen doors. She sat in the new seat and ate and watched the room. Edmund Voss, the senior political advisor, looked at her new placement for 2 seconds, before returning his attention to his soup. Edmund Voss was a man of about 55, with a long face and deep-set eyes, and the particular quality of total control over his external presentation that is either the result of extraordinary discipline or extraordinary fear of what would happen if the control slipped. She had been watching him for a week, and she had noticed that his composure was very good, and that the moments when it handled extra load were visible to her in ways they were probably not visible to people who were not looking for exactly what she was looking for. She stored this observation and did not act on it yet. The morning meals began without formal arrangement. Iris mentioned, with her characteristic directness, that the king took his early meals in the smaller room, off the main hall, and that she had received a word, through Owen Drake, that Ilara was welcome to make use of the same room. She went the next morning half expecting to find it empty, and found Aldrich already at the table with a book and a cup of tea that had been there long enough to be at the perfect temperature. He looked up when she came in, and then looked back at his book. She sat down. She poured tea. A plate arrived from the kitchen. They ate. After several mornings of this, words began to appear between the eating and the reading. The words were careful at first on both sides, careful in the way that things are careful when both people involved have learned that careless words tend to cost them. He asked about the River Systems book and what she was learning from it. She told him, specifically, and added what she had concluded from it about the historical development of the territory's eastern settlements. He added information she did not have, and the addition was made without the quality that additions of superior information often carry, the quality of demonstrating that the addition was necessary, and she noticed this specifically because she had grown up in a world where being corrected almost always came with that quality attached. She asked about the territory's administrative history. He told her. She asked about his advisors, and which of them were genuinely useful, versus which were there for reasons that were more about management than about utility. He told her, with a directness that surprised her, because it was not the diplomatic version of that accounting, but the actual version. The version a person gives to someone they have decided can be trusted with actual things. She asked about himself, directly, not with the formal framing that questions about kings usually carried, but in the plain way she asked everything. He looked at her when she did this, in the particular way of someone who has not recently been asked about himself, by someone who was genuinely asking. Then he answered in the same plain way. He told her what his life had actually been, not the chronicle version, the real version. Born into a nature that nobody around him had precedent for, or language for, surrounded by people who were loyal to the function of a king, and managed their relationship to what was underneath that function by not referencing it. A system that worked, because everyone in it maintained it. A life that was organized and productive, and completely hollow at its center, in the specific way that lives are hollow, when the people in them have never once been known by another person, rather than managed by one. She told him about Ashvale with the same honesty, the cracked table, the warped mirror, the schoolteacher who had lent her books, the animals, the 22 years of watching the village look at her face and complete its calculation, and return to its existing arrangements, without any of those arrangements making room for an accurate version of who she actually was. He listened with the specific quality of listening that she had encountered very rarely, which was complete and unhurried, and stayed on what was being said until it was genuinely finished, rather than moving toward the next thing while the person was still speaking. She thought that the specific quality of his listening was probably what she was going to find hardest to leave, if she ever had to leave. On a morning near the end of October, she sat down at the table and found a book beside her plate. She recognized it as the second volume of the River Systems series she had been looking for in the library without success. She looked at the book, she looked at him. He was reading his own page. She opened the second volume. There were more books after that, and she understood what they were without naming them aloud, because naming them aloud would have changed their nature in a way she did not want to change. They appeared on the writing desk in the East Wing room, and on the shelf in the library alcove, and occasionally beside the morning tea, and they were always the specific thing she had mentioned once in passing, which meant he had been listening to all of it. She returned the currency in the only equal form, which was listening of the same quality back, and asking questions about the things underneath what was being said, rather than just what was said, and being honest about what she thought, even when what she thought was not simple. Edmund Voss passed the door of the small dining room on 5 separate occasions during this period. On the 5th occasion, Ilara met his eyes through the doorway for 1 second before he continued walking. In that second, she saw what she had been seeing accumulating since the night her dinner seat was moved. The thing that had moved past the watching stage into something more active. She filed it carefully. Outside the morning window, the forest beyond the outer wall was turning amber with the season, and the inner yard was busy with the ordinary business of the castle, and 7 wolves moved through it in their usual patterns, free and unhurried, going where they chose without asking permission. She watched the wolves and thought about what Valethorn was turning out to be, which was considerably more than what it had looked like from the road. Then she picked up her fork and finished her breakfast and went to the stables to see Calm. The wolves began following Ilara in the 2nd week of October, and they did not stop. The first one she noticed was the large female, the oldest of the 7, the one with the white marking on her chest that set her apart from the others. She appeared at the edge of the inner yard on a Tuesday morning, when Alara was crossing it on the way to the stables, and she fell into a parallel course, at a distance of about 40 feet, not approaching, not retreating, simply accompanying, and she sat down in the yard outside the stable door, while Alara went in, and was still there, when Alara came out an hour later. She did not try to manage this or redirect it. She had never tried to manage or redirect what animals did when they chose to be near her. They had their reasons, and their reasons were their own, and her experience was that the reasons were always accurate, that animals did not spend their time on things that were not relevant. By the end of the first week, 2 wolves accompanied her on every route she took through the castle grounds. By the end of the second week, 3 were standard, and 4 was not unusual. On one occasion when she came through the interior corridor and emerged into the east yard, she found 3 wolves sitting outside the corridor door, which was inside the castle building, which meant they had come through the castle to get there. The court's reaction to this developed in layers. The first layer was the careful pretense that nothing unusual was happening, because pretending nothing unusual was happening was the court's default position on anything it had not yet decided how to classify. The second layer, which arrived after the wolves had been following Alara for 10 days and showed no sign of stopping, was a more active kind of management, the kind that involved lowered voices in corridors, and the specific type of glance that is designed to communicate something between the people exchanging it, without acknowledging that anything is being communicated. She let all of this run. She had no ability to stop the wolves from accompanying her, and no desire to, and she had no ability to stop the court from discussing it, and no energy to spend on them discussing it. She was in Valethorn to do what she was actually doing, which was learning what this place was, and what she was inside it, and the court's opinion of what she was doing was not a useful input into that process. The incident in the secondary corridor happened on a Thursday evening. The man was named Gerald, and he held a minor position in the castle's household administration. He had been among the group in the courtyard on Alara's first day, and had been among the people who had done the particular 2-second assessment of her face on that occasion. He was returning from the afternoon drawing room, gathering at an hour, and in a condition that suggested the gathering had involved more wine than the court's usual consumption, and he came around the bend of the secondary corridor, as Alara was walking the other direction, and stopped in a way that used the full width of the corridor. He looked at her face. He said something. She had heard versions of what he said, in many registers, over 22 years. She knew exactly the mechanism of it, the specific use of a person's visible difference, as the delivery vehicle for a verdict about their worth. She had heard it from children who had not yet learned that having a thought and saying the thought were different things, and from adults who had learned this and did not care. She had heard it from people she knew and from strangers. She had always received it the same way, which was without flinching and without responding, because responding required energy that she preferred to spend on other things, and because the response that she actually wanted to give was never the one that was productive. She looked at Gerald and said nothing. And then from the corridor junction behind her came a sound. It was low and not exactly a growl. It was what lives immediately adjacent to a growl, when the thing making it is deciding whether a growl is actually necessary and has communicated clearly enough without one. Gerald's eyes went to a point over Alara's left shoulder, and his face changed very quickly from one shade to another, the way faces change when the situation has become something entirely different from what it was 5 seconds ago. He took 1 step back, then 2 more. Then he turned and walked back the way he had come, quickly, without looking at anything behind him. Alara turned around. 3 wolves, the large female in the center, 2 others flanking her. They were sitting in the corridor junction with the specific quality of stillness that belongs to animals who have achieved their objective and are in no hurry about the rest of it. The female was looking at the space where Gerald had been. Then she looked at Alara. Alara looked at her for a moment. "Thank you," she said. The female's ears rotated forward. Her amber eyes moved over Alara with the thoughtful attention of an animal conducting an assessment. Alara continued to the library. Aldrich found out about the incident the way he found out about most things in the castle, which was through the specific combination of Owen Drake's attention and the castle's communication systems. He did not reference it directly at the next morning's breakfast, but Gerald was not seen in the secondary corridor after that week, and the specific managed invisibility that settled around him in the castle afterward had the quality of something that had been arranged. The riding party went out on a morning in late October, when the first serious frost had come overnight, and turned everything it touched into the sharp, precise version of itself. The ground rang under the horses' feet. The air was cold enough that breathing it was an active experience. The remaining leaves were the deep amber and red of a season that was ending with full commitment. Alara rode Calm at the front of the group, because Calm went where Alara was, and the path through the forest was wide enough for 2 horses side by side. Aldrich rode beside her on a large gray horse, who moved with the measured certainty of an animal that had been doing this for many years, and saw no reason to change its approach. The 4 other riders from the court were behind them. The wolves ran ahead, visible in the frost-bright gaps between the trees, moving through the forest with the fluid certainty of animals at home. For a long while they rode in the cold morning without speaking, and the forest was extraordinary in the frost and the low autumn light, and the silence between them was the settled kind that had grown up across the mornings in the small dining room and the library afternoons, the kind that did not need filling because it was not empty. He said, eventually, without looking at her, "You are not afraid of this." It was not quite a question. "I was afraid of many things when I was younger," she said. She watched the wolves moving between the amber trees ahead. "I spent a long time making myself smaller because of it, and then I used up all the smaller available, and the things I had been afraid of turned out to be less interested in me than I had assumed, and then I decided not to be afraid, because being afraid had not helped anything." He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved through the frost-ringing forest. "That is not usually something a person can simply decide," he said. "I know," she said. "I did not decide once and be done with it. I decided many times, and it got easier each time, the way anything gets easier when you do it enough." He looked at her then. The amber of his eyes in the cold morning light was the clearest and most available she had yet seen it. "What made you leave?" he said. "Not what made her come, what made her leave." She thought about this honestly. "Nothing was keeping me," she said, "and everything here was unknown. I have spent my whole life in a place where everything about me had already been decided. Unknown meant nothing had been decided yet. That felt like the most significant advantage available." He looked back at the forest ahead. "Most people would find that terrifying," he said. "Most people have something in the known worth protecting," she said. "I did not have that." He said nothing for a while. A branch somewhere above them released its frost load and scattered cold white down through the canopy. Calm flicked an ear at it without changing her pace. Then he said, "I have been known here all my life, and it has never felt like it." She looked at him. He was not looking at her. His face was in its public stillness, but the public stillness had something showing through it, in the specific way things show through when the person wearing it has said something more honest than they usually allow. She did not say anything in response. She let what he had said be in the air between them and stay there. They rode back through the outer gate in the mid-morning, with the frost beginning to ease off the stones in the early sun. She went to the stables, and he went wherever kings went, and as she walked Calm back to her stall she was thinking about the thing he had said, and about what it cost him to say it, and about the specific quality of understanding that came from having been looked at by an entire community your whole life, without once being seen accurately. She knew exactly what that was. That evening, Edmund Voss was at his desk in his office in the administrative wing, with a sheet of unmarked paper in front of him, and a pen in his hand, and he was writing in the careful, deliberate way of someone composing something that needed to be correct. He wrote for a long time. When he was finished, he read what he had written twice, made 2 small changes, folded the paper, and sealed it. He gave it to a courier with instructions that did not go through the castle's formal systems. He sat back in his chair. He was very still. He had a specific kind of stillness when he had completed a decision, a settled, forward-looking quality. The stillness of a man who has identified a problem and implemented a solution, and is now waiting for the solution to do its work. Alara did not know about this. She was in the East Wing room at the writing desk with the lamp lit against the dark, writing in her notebook. The forest was invisible outside the window, a black mass against the darker sky, and somewhere out in it, the wolves were doing what wolves did in the deep autumn dark. She wrote about Aldrich's face when he said that he had been known here all his life, and it had never felt like it. She wrote about what that sentence cost him to say, and what it meant that he had said it to her. She closed the notebook and put it away, and sat for a while in the lamplight, listening to the castle settle around her, and thinking about what was happening here, which was something she did not yet have a name for, but which was becoming too specific to remain unnamed for much longer. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to come down, very lightly, almost invisible against the dark sky, settling on the stones of the castle walls and the trees of the forest, in the particular quiet way of the first snow, which asks nothing, and announces nothing, and simply arrives. The castle changed in the days before the full moon, in ways that were not announced, and did not need to be. Elara had been paying attention to the castle's patterns for 6 weeks, and she noticed the change, the way she noticed all changes in systems, that she had been observing carefully, not as a single event, but as an accumulation of small adjustments, that together formed something legible. The kitchen staff shifted their schedule, so that the latest work was done by an earlier hour. The guard rotation changed in a way that was not visible to someone who had not been observing the regular one. The wolves, all 7 of them, began spending more time in the interior of the castle than they usually did, moving through the inner spaces with a quicker and more purposeful quality than their ordinary movement. And the people of the court moved through their days with an additional layer of organization, small things, the way doors were checked, the way certain conversations ended a little earlier than they might have, the way nobody walked in the inner yard in the evening without looking at the sky first. None of these things were dramatic. Taken individually, none of them meant anything specific. Taken together, they meant a great deal. Iris came to her room on the Wednesday evening, with extra candles and a hot drink and a wool shawl she did not need, and she delivered, with careful precision, the message that certain evenings in the month tended to be quieter than others, and that tomorrow evening was one of those, and that many of the castle's residents found it most comfortable to spend such evenings in their own quarters, with their doors closed. She said this without meeting Elara's eyes directly, which was unusual for Iris, who generally treated eye contact as a tool rather than a courtesy. After she delivered the message, she stood for a moment, with the extra items in her arms, and looked at the floor near Elara's feet. "Iris," Elara said. Iris looked up. "I understand," Elara said. She said it in the way that meant she understood the specific thing, and not just the politely presented version of it. Iris looked at her for a moment, then she nodded, once, and put the extra candles on the shelf, and the drink on the desk, and the shawl on the chair, and left. Elara sat at the writing desk for a while after she left, and thought about what she knew, and what she was going to do about what she knew. She knew that the full moon was the condition. She knew that the condition was significant enough that an entire large household had developed a complex and practiced system for managing it. She knew what she had felt from below her window on the first night in the servants' corridor, the specific quality of the amber gaze looking up at her, which was not the quality of something threatening but the quality of something that was managing something very large alone. She knew what she had felt from him in the paddock when his eyes closed, and calm pressed her nose to his palm. She knew what she felt from him at the breakfast table every morning, which was the specific weight of a person carrying something enormous by themselves, because there was nobody else to carry it with. She thought about what it would mean to be the only thing in the world that you were, with no one to learn from, and no one to ask, and no one to sit beside you, when the thing that lived inside you came to its peak, and pushed against the inside of you, and all you could do was push back alone. She thought about cold stone in a moonlit yard, and that kind of alone. She blew out the desk lamp and lay on the bed with the darkness around her, and listened to the castle beginning its Thursday evening adjustment. The sounds she had mapped over 6 weeks, the footsteps and voices and distant kitchen work, thinned gradually. Not all at once. Gradually, over the course of an hour, until the castle's ordinary background had reduced to almost nothing, and what remained was the castle itself, its own stone and wood sounds, and the wind. And then something else. From below and to her left, from somewhere in the lower interior of the castle. Breathing. She had been waiting for it, she understood. She had been lying in the dark listening for it since Iris left, though she would not have said so if someone had asked her. She had been waiting for it the way you wait, without naming the waiting, for something that you already know is coming. It was not a human sound. It was breathing in the category of large, in the way that large means something different when it comes from the interior of a living thing, rather than from a machine. Slow and measured and enormous, each breath moving the air in the room in a way that should not have been physically possible, given the distance between her room and whatever was below. She sat up. She sat on the edge of the bed for 30 seconds and examined what she felt. She did not feel afraid. She had been doing this examination since she was 4 years old, checking herself for fear the way you check a bag for missing things, and she was certain enough in the results of 22 years of this practice to trust what the examination found. What she found was not fear. What she found was the thing she felt when she was near a large animal in significant distress, the pull of it, the specific call of something suffering alone that her particular nature had always responded to without asking her permission. She put on her shoes. She took the extra shawl that Iris had left on the chair. She opened the door to the corridor. It was entirely empty. Every door sealed, no light under any of them. The castle was holding itself inside itself, with the collective breath-held quality of something managing a situation it had been managing for a long time, by a method that worked through coordinated stillness. She moved through the corridor and down the back stair and through the heavy door that opened onto the inner yard. She stepped into the moonlight. The moon was directly above, and it was full and bright enough to read by, casting shadows with clear edges on the paved stone of the inner yard. The yard was wide and empty except for the pine tree and the storage structures against the far wall and the thing in the center of it. King Aldrich was on his knees in the center of the yard. Both hands were flat on the stone. His head was bowed forward. His whole body was locked in the particular posture of sustained, committed resistance. Not the frozen posture of someone who cannot move, but the active and shaking posture of someone pushing against an internal force with everything they had. And he was wrong. Not dramatically, not impossibly, but wrong in size, in the specific way that she had noticed twice before. The way that the dimensions of him did not quite match the person she had been watching eat breakfast and read books for 6 weeks. The clothes he wore were strained across the back and shoulders. His hair was loose and dark with effort. The sound of his breathing was the sound she had heard from 2 floors up, massive and measured and costing something with each cycle. She stood at the door for 3 seconds. She did not debate with herself. She did not conduct a lengthy internal assessment of the risks. She had already done this in the room, lying in the dark, listening for the breathing she had known would come. The decision had already been made by whatever part of her made decisions before the thinking part arrived. She walked into the yard. She walked the way she walked toward animals in crisis, with the evenness of a person who has no agenda beyond arriving at the place she is going to. Unhurried. Even. Occupying the distance between the door and the center of the yard at the pace that communicated, to everything in the yard that was capable of reading it, that she had come without threat and without agenda, and would stay as long as the situation required. She sat down on the cold stone 6 feet from him, cross-legged, her hands open on her knees. The stone was cold through the fabric of her dress. She registered this and stayed. He knew she was there. The change in his breathing told her. A long exhale that was different in quality from the ones before it. One of the braced hands lifted by a fraction from the stone and went back down. He knew she was there and he had not asked her to leave, and she understood what that meant because she had been paying attention to him for long enough to know that a man who managed every aspect of how he presented himself to other people would have asked her to leave if leaving was what he wanted. She breathed. Slowly in, slowly out. She found the still center that she had always had, the part of herself that 22 years of Ashvale had tested and not reached, and she let the whole of her outside match it. She was simply there, present, not trying to do anything, except be the specific fact of another person sitting on the cold stone nearby. She counted, not to track time, but to give her breathing a point of regularity that she could maintain without effort. At 6 minutes, the shaking had decreased in intensity. At 9 minutes, it was intermittent rather than continuous. At 11 minutes, it stopped. The yard was quiet. The moon sat above them, and the pine tree stood in its shadow, and the wolves had gathered at the edges of the yard, all 7 of them, in the slow and silent way of animals who have come to witness something that does not require their intervention. He raised his head. His face was the thing underneath the public face, not glimpsed this time, not for a fraction of a second before it was managed, fully visible. The exhaustion was complete in every line of it, and beneath the exhaustion was something that she had not seen on a human face in this way before. The specific exposure of a person who has spent so long maintaining a management system for how they are perceived, that they have no reserve system available when the management system is temporarily offline. He was entirely open. Every part of him that he had spent years constructing a careful presentation for was simply there, unmanaged, available, looking at her. The amber of his eyes in the moonlight was burning and direct and contained nothing that was not true. "No one has ever stayed," he said. It came out barely above a whisper. She looked at him with the full weight of her attention, the same quality of attention she had given to animals all her life, and had learned to give to people she decided were worth giving it to. "I know what it is to be something that people decide to be afraid of," she said. "I have never agreed with the decision, not when it is made about me, and not when it is made about someone else." Something moved across his face. Not one thing. Several things at once. Things that had been waiting behind the public face for a moment, when the public face was unavailable. She watched them move through, and did not try to identify each one individually. It was enough to know they were there. He looked at her hand, resting open on the cold stone between them. He looked at her face. Then, with the deliberate quality of someone making a choice they are fully aware of making, he reached out and picked up her hand from the stone and held it, both of his hands around hers. Not tightly, not gripping. Holding it the way you hold something that turns out to be more real than you expected, with a grip that was both certain and uncertain at the same moment. Because he was both, and for the first time in her experience of him was not managing either. She felt what he felt. She felt the layers of it, the exhaustion, and the relief, and the thing underneath all of it that was older than both, the specific recognition that her nature had been pressing toward since the first night she looked down from her window and saw amber light looking up. It was not complicated. It was the simplest thing available. Two people who had each spent their whole lives being something that the world around them had decided it knew how to categorize, sitting on cold stone together under a full moon, with one of them finally not alone in the hardest hour of the month. She did not take her hand back. Above them the moon continued its constant movement that looked like stillness, and the wolves sat in their ring around the yard, and were patient and present in the way animals are when they are attending something important, and the castle held its long, practiced silence on all sides. She thought about the road out of Ashvale, about the trees growing taller with every mile, about the wolf in the gap between the oaks watching the carriage pass with amber eyes. She thought about a cold servant's corridor room, and amber light below a pine tree, and the specific quality of being looked at by something that had not yet decided anything. She thought about what she was doing here, which was sitting on cold stone in a moonlit yard holding the hand of a king who had been alone in the most important thing about himself for his entire life, and being completely still, and being completely all right. "The stone is cold," she said quietly. He looked at her, the open face, still there. He was adjusting, the slow adjustment of something that has been holding a weight alone for a very long time, and has been offered, for the first time, the possibility of putting some of it down. He rose from his knees. He stood in the moonlight, still holding her hand, very tall against the castle walls and the stars behind him. They stood in the moonlit yard, and neither of them spoke, and the wolves sat in their patient ring, and the castle breathed its ancient breathing, and the night was very large and very quiet around them both. The day after the full moon, Valethorn resumed its ordinary shape from the outside, and from the inside, everything was different, in the way that things are different when something significant has occurred, and both parties in it know it, and neither of them is going to name it prematurely. The kitchen resumed its morning noise. Morris the chamberlain moved through the corridors. The court gathered in the main hall. The guards walked their rounds. The wolves settled back into their usual yard positions with the settled, definitive quality of animals, returning to routines they have no interest in interrupting. She came to the small dining room the next morning, and Aldrich was already there. His book was open at the middle of it, which meant he had been there for some time, and had been genuinely reading. When she came in, he looked up, and then looked back at his book, and neither look was the public version, and neither was an announcement of anything. They were simply true, the way things are when the management system around them has been temporarily removed, and both people involved discover that what is underneath the management is more bearable than they thought. She poured tea. She sat. A plate arrived. He pushed a book across the table without looking up from his page. She looked at it. It was the third volume of the geography series that no southern bookseller was likely to stock. the one she had been searching the library shelves for over 3 weeks. She looked at him. He was on his page. She opened the 3rd volume. After that, books appeared with a regularity that she did not mention and he did not explain. One on the writing desk in the East Wing room in the evening. One on the library shelf in her corner. One beside the morning tea. Always the specific thing she had mentioned in passing, in the specific way that things are mentioned when you want them, but are not expecting to receive them. He had been listening to all of it. All of the passing mentions, and the library searches, and the 3 times she had checked the geography section without finding what she was looking for. He had been listening with the same quality of attention he brought to everything he considered worth his attention, which was total and unhurried, and did not miss anything. She gave the currency back in the only equal form, which was the same quality of listening directed at him. She asked the questions underneath what he was saying, rather than just about what he said. She did not manage the conversations toward comfortable territory when they moved into something that was not comfortable. She stayed in the true places and waited for him to arrive there too, and he always did, because he was the kind of person who had been waiting his whole life for somewhere true to arrive at. He told her what his life had actually been over mornings and library afternoons and occasional evenings when the small dining room had emptied of everyone else and the fire was still going. Not the chronicle version, the real one, in the way that real things are told, in pieces, when the relevant piece is available, rather than in a linear sequence. He told her what it was to be born into a nature that nobody around you has language for. He told her about the first full moon he could remember, which was when he was 8, and the people responsible for him had been afraid, and he had been more afraid of their fear than of his own experience, because their fear had told him that what he was something that required fear. He told her about the years of building the management system, the careful presentation, the public face, the elaborate structure of normalcy that everyone in the castle participated in by mutual unspoken agreement, because the alternative was not participating, and nobody had a vocabulary for the alternative. He told her about the specific loneliness of a life organized around the management of what you were, rather than the living of it. She listened to all of it, with the complete attention she had given it from the first morning, and she asked questions that went to the center of things, and she did not flinch from any of it. She told him about Ashvale with the same honesty, the kitchen table and the mirror, the school teacher, whose name was Arthur Crane, who had lent her books consistently for a decade and had never once made her feel that the lending required anything from her except the reading of them, the animals. The fox and the hawk and the deer and the wolf in the road, and what it felt like to feel what they felt, the direct and wordless arrival of another creature's interior state in her chest, the 22 years of occupying a space that had decided everything about her, and the practice of maintaining, inside all of that, a part of herself that the decisions could not reach. He listened. He was the best listener she had encountered, which was a specific and measurable quality, and not a general impression. One morning he said, "What did it feel like? Staying." He meant the moonlit yard. He did not mean anything else. She thought about it honestly. "Like what I do with frightened animals," she said, except that the frightened animal was considerably more complicated. She looked at her tea. "And the frightened animal was you." He looked at her. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile but was in the family of one. It was brief. "What does it feel like for you?" she asked. "The full moon. The shift." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer, and then he did. He said it felt like a tide, something that built for weeks, and then at the peak, became a force that wanted to go through you, rather than around you. He said the force was not inherently painful, it was simply what it was. The pain was in the resistance. The resistance was what he had always done, because the system around him had been built to accommodate the resistance, and without the resistance, the system had no function. "What would it look like if the resistance was not the point?" she said. He looked at her. "I have never been in conditions where that question was available," he said. She thought, "You are now." She did not say this aloud. She let the thought live in the room without being expressed, and she thought about the month ahead and the next full moon, and the stone bench in the inner yard that was there if they needed it. On the nights between the full moons she read, and she worked with the animals, and she ate her meals at the table, and walked through the castle, and the court continued its complex relationship with her presence, which was shifting slowly in the direction of something that could not be sustained indefinitely. She was not going anywhere. She was doing real things that produced real results. The animal work in the outer yard had expanded in the weeks since she had reorganized the menagerie approach, and animals that had been unhandled for months were now calm enough that Dan Briggs could work with them. The castle staff who moved through the east outer yard had started stopping to look, and then staying to watch, and then occasionally asking questions, and she answered the questions directly and completely, and without making them feel that the asking required something from them. Small things were changing, slowly, through the accumulation of ordinary days, the way real changes always happen when they happen at all. Edmund Voss had received a reply to his sealed letter. She did not know this. She did not know about the letter. What she knew was what she felt from him when he passed the dining room door, which was the quality of a man in the implementation phase of a decision, the specific committed quality of someone who has planned a thing carefully and is now waiting for the plan to execute. She knew this quality from watching animals and from watching people, and she trusted what she knew. She thought about what she could do about it, which was not much. She had no specific information. She had only the thing she felt from him, which was not actionable and would not be received well if she tried to act on it. What she could do was continue being exactly what she was, which was someone whose record in this castle was clear and consistent and real, and let the plan run into that record when it arrived. She was at the writing desk one evening in late November when Iris knocked at the door. Iris came in and sat on the edge of the chair by the window and said, without preamble, that she had noticed Edmund Voss had been asking questions about Alara's movements over the past 6 weeks, specifically about which routes she had taken through the castle grounds and on which days the riding party had gone out. She said she was not sure what to do with this information, and so she was giving it to Alara. Alara sat at the writing desk and looked at Iris. "Thank you," she said. "You are correct to tell me." Iris nodded. She stood up. "Is there anything I can do?" she said. "Keep doing what you are doing," Alara said, "being useful and paying attention." Iris nodded again and left. Alara sat at the writing desk for a while after she left. She thought about what Edmund Voss was building, and what it would look like when it arrived, and what her position would be when it did. She thought about the breakfast table, and the amber eyes, and the cold stone, and the wolves in their patient ring. She thought about 2 words, which were the only 2 she would need when the time came. She picked up her notebook. She wrote. The castle was quiet around her. Outside the window, the winter forest was bare and black against the dark sky, and the first snow of the season from the week before was still on the ground, pale and settled, catching what little light there was and holding it. She wrote until the lamp needed trimming. Then she put the notebook away and looked at the dark window for a while. She had come a long way from the cracked table and the warped mirror and the village that had never looked at her and seen what was actually there. She was not afraid of what was coming. She was ready. Owen Drake set the document on the desk with both hands, and the look on his face when he did it was the look of a man who had been given something he genuinely wished he had not been asked to carry. He stood and said nothing. He was letting the document speak first. Aldrich read it from the beginning to the end, without moving through it faster than understanding required. He read the formal accusation. He read the 4 pieces of attached evidence. He read the list of dates, and the description of the drop location, and the transcribed message contents, and the anonymous statement from a named castle resident. He read all of it once, and then he read the transcribed messages a second time, and the list of dates a second time, with the particular attention of someone who is not looking for what is there, but for what should be there and is not. He set it down. He looked at the wolves in the inner yard through the window. "Who has seen this?" he said. Owen told him. Edmund Voss had brought it through the council, with full documentation of the process. 3 senior council members had reviewed it, and formally requested the assembly be convened. The constitutional requirement was clear. A formal accusation through the council, with supporting evidence, and 3 council endorsements, required an assembly response within 48 hours. He built this over weeks, Aldrich said. It was not a question. The construction is detailed, Owen said. Some of the foundational documents predate the events they claim to describe. Aldrich looked at the date list. He looked at the 3rd date specifically, which was the 14th of the month before. He looked at it for a moment. He looked at the transcribed messages. He read the first paragraph of the first one with a very specific attention. Then he stood. "Call the assembly. I want the guard captain in position before it opens. And I want you to pull the weather records for the 14th. Owen's face shifted by a very small degree. The shift was the shift of someone who has just understood what is about to happen. "Yes," he said, and left quickly. Aldrich stood at the window. He thought about the 14th of the month before, which had been a day he remembered with specificity, because he had been in the castle all day, and had rescheduled 2 meetings because of the rain, and the rain had been continuous from before sunrise. The inner yard had flooded in the low corner near the pine tree by mid-morning. The riding party had not gone out. He had been in the library for most of the afternoon, which was where he went when bad weather canceled his outdoor schedule, and he had shared the west alcove with Alara for 3 hours, while the rain came down outside the library windows. The 14th was one of the 6 dates on the list. He thought about the transcribed messages. He knew how Alara wrote. He had read her notes in the margins of returned library books, and the practical letters she sent to Iris about castle matters that Iris had shown him, and the sentences she wrote directly to him when a thought was clearer in writing than in speaking. She wrote the way she spoke, directly and without formal construction, with the specific contractions and the grounded vocabulary of a person whose relationship with language was a working one, rather than a decorative one. She did not write in formal grammatical registers. She wrote in the register of someone who wanted to be clearly understood. The transcribed messages were not in that register. They were in the formal, constructed register of someone who wrote documents professionally and whose sense of what writing looked like came from documents rather than from speech. He thought about Edmund Voss, who had been writing documents professionally for 11 years. He did not feel anger. What he felt was the specific clarity that arrived when a complex situation resolved into something simple. Edmund had built this carefully and had made one error, which was that the error was in the specifics, in the detail of the 14th, and that the error was there because Edmund had not known about the weather on the 14th, because he had built the evidence in advance, before the events it claimed to describe, and had chosen the dates from the writing schedule as it had been planned, rather than as it had been executed. The writing party had been scheduled for the 14th. The writing party had not gone out, because the weather made the ground unsuitable. Edmund had not known about the weather, because he had completed his construction of the evidence before the weather happened. This was a recoverable mistake for the document. It was not recoverable in the context of what Aldrich knew. He went to the throne hall, and took his seat, and watched the assembly gather. Edmund Voss presented the evidence with masterful care. He was precisely as Alara had once described him to Aldrich over breakfast, very good at his work, and not accounting for the right variable. He laid the evidence in its sequence with the practiced skill of someone who had been constructing persuasive documents for a long time, each piece placed to support the next, the whole structure building toward the conclusion that the court was being asked to reach. He made no dramatic statements. He used no language that would look excessive in retrospect. He simply made the evidence available, and relied on the court to do the work of interpretation, which was the correct approach, and would have worked if the evidence had been real. He stepped back. The main doors opened. Alara walked in. Aldrich watched her come down the length of the throne hall from the main doors to the center floor, and what he watched was a person who had been making this walk her entire life. Not this specific walk in this specific hall, but the walk that was this one in its essential nature. The walk through a room full of people who had decided something about her, and were waiting to see whether she was going to give them the confirmation they expected. She had been making that walk for 22 years. She walked it the way she had always walked it, with her chin level and her back straight, and her pace even, and her eyes open, looking at the room without performing anything for it. Neither defiance nor apology, nor the specific kind of performed innocence that innocent people under accusation sometimes feel compelled to produce, because the pressure of the room demands something, and performed innocence is the nearest available option. She reached the center of the hall. She turned. She looked at the assembly. She looked at Edmund Voss. He looked back with his professional neutral face. She looked at it for 1 second with the specific look she had, that saw through surfaces to whatever was underneath them, the same look she used on animals and on people, the look that found the thing that was actually true regardless of what was being presented. She looked at the throne. He looked back. She said 2 words, clearly, and at a volume the whole hall could hear. "You know me." The silence in the hall became the kind of silence that happens when a room full of people stops moving at the same moment. Aldrich rose. He stepped down from the dais without announcing that he was doing so. He moved to the evidence table. He looked at the date list. He spoke about the 14th of the previous month. He said that on the 14th it had rained from before sunrise, and that the inner yard had flooded by mid-morning, and that the riding party had not gone out, and he said that any of the council members present on that day could verify this, and 2 of them nodded without being asked. He spoke about the drop location. He said that the hollow oak on the northeast track junction was not accessible from the northeast track, and that it was accessible only from the west track at the point of the upper meadow approach, and that the riding party had used the west track twice that autumn, and that neither of those dates appeared in the evidence. He spoke about the language of the transcribed messages. He read 2 sentences from the first message aloud, and 2 sentences from a letter Alara had written to Owen Drake about the outer yard storage situation 2 weeks prior, which Owen produced from his folder, and he let the room hear the difference, which was complete and absolute. The difference between the formal constructed grammar of a document professional and the direct working grammar of a person who wrote the way she thought. He said that the anonymous source named in the 4th document had been identified, in an investigation conducted over the previous 3 days, as a former castle servant who had left the castle's employment 14 months ago and had not returned, and was not, and had not been a current resident. He set the evidence down. He turned to Edmund Voss. Edmund's control was very good. 11 years of professional composure is not dismantled in a moment, but what had happened in the room in the past 15 minutes had shifted the ground under the composure, and the composure was doing visible work maintaining itself. Aldrich said, quietly, that Edmund had prepared this before the events it claimed to describe. He said that the 14th date was a planning error, that Edmund had chosen it from the writing schedule, as it had been planned, and had not known that the weather would cancel the party on that day. He said that the council would conduct a full review beginning immediately, and that Edmund would cooperate with it completely. He turned away. He walked back across the hall. He passed the place where Edmund was standing without looking at him again. He walked across the center floor toward the dais. He stopped in front of Alara. The room was watching with the specific quality of attention a room holds when it knows it is witnessing something that it will be describing to other people for a very long time. He did not look at the room. He looked at her. "I have always known you," he said, quietly, just for her. He continued to the dais. Edmund Voss was escorted from the hall by the castle guard. The assembly was formally closed, the hall emptied with the specific rapid energy of people who have just witnessed something significant and need to find their people immediately. Alara stood in the center of the emptying hall. After a while, Iris appeared beside her right shoulder, very quietly, with the expression of someone who has just seen something they are going to remember for the rest of their life, and who is also conducting a practical assessment of whether the person next to them is all right. "All right?" Iris said. "Yes," Alara said. She said it without hesitation, because she meant it completely. She was standing in the center of a room that had just been used to attempt to remove her from a place she had built something real in, and she was entirely all right, in the specific sense of standing on ground inside herself, that nothing in the room had moved. She walked out of the throne hall into the castle that she had walked into on a cold autumn afternoon, with 1 bag and 7 books, and it felt exactly like what it was, which was the place where she lived. She went to the tower that evening, not because she was distressed, but because she needed the sky, and because the tower was the place in the castle that gave her the sky in the form she preferred, which was the full version, all of it at once, uninterrupted by walls or windows, or the ordinary boundary conditions of indoor life. The back stair that led to the tower was narrow, and used only by the cleaning staff for the upper levels. She had found it in her 3rd week in the castle, and had been using it ever since on the evenings, when she needed air and height, and the particular quality of perspective that comes from being above everything that has been happening to you. The tower door was heavy, and required real effort, and opened onto a narrow stone walkway that was too thin for anything, except standing on and looking out. She stood at the outer rail, and looked north. The forest ran from the base of the outer wall, to the edge of everything visible. The castle spread in all directions below her. The guards moved on the outer wall with their torchlight making slow arcs. In the inner yard, the pine tree stood in the dark, and around it, 2 of the wolves were sitting in the way they sat everywhere, with the patient amber certainty of animals that did not need the world to hurry up and explain itself. The sky above was the deep blue of late autumn evening, the specific shade she had been watching from the east wing window every night since her first evening in that room, and it was full of stars. She had been there for half an hour when she heard the door. She knew the weight of his step on stone. She had learned it across 6 weeks of the same building, and she did not turn around when she heard it. She simply moved her hands on the stone rail and waited for him to arrive beside her. He came to stand at the rail without announcing himself, without the specific social sounds that people make when they are joining someone who is already somewhere. He simply arrived, the way he arrived in rooms, with the deliberate groundedness that she had always found more honest than the announced arrival. They stood together in the cold. Below them the castle did its evening work. The guards on the outer wall were tiny and moving in their slow circuits. In the inner yard, the wolves had both turned their faces upward. He stood beside her for a long time and said nothing. She had learned not to rush his silences. His silences were active. Things happened in them. What came out the other side of them was always more true than what would have come out if she had hurried him, and she had never been someone who prioritized the faster answer over the accurate one. When he spoke, his voice was low and careful, and he was looking at the forest. "I did not know," he said, "that it was possible to go an entire life not knowing that something was missing from it. I thought the condition I had was the whole condition. I thought the aloneness was simply what my life was." He paused. "I did not feel it as a wound. You cannot feel the absence of something as a wound if you have no reference point for the thing that is absent." She looked at the forest with him. "When you arrived at this castle," he said, "something in me went quiet. Not the full moon kind, not the kind before something difficult, not the managed kind that I maintain in rooms. The other kind, the kind I had not known existed because I had not known there was a kind of quiet that came from something being present rather than from something being suppressed." He turned to look at her. "There is a thing in the old knowledge of what I am," he said. He chose each word with the care he brought to important things. "Something they call the fated mate. The word does not translate perfectly into the language I have always spoken. It means something closer to the one person who answers the oldest part of what you are, not chosen by the mind, not selected by reason or preference or decision. Known by the part of you that existed before you had any of those things. The part that has been there since before memory, that has been looking for one specific thing without knowing it was looking, and that goes still when it finds it." She turned to look at him. The amber of his eyes in the starlight was the same amber they had been below her window on the first night, looking up. The same amber they had been in the paddock. The same amber they had been in the moonlit yard on the full moon night. Completely consistent, completely present, containing no version of itself that was managed. "I have been refusing to understand it," he said, "because I did not believe that I had the right to something that felt like that. I have spent my whole life being the thing that required accommodation, the thing that the castle built its systems around managing, the thing that everyone around me organized themselves in relation to. I did not think that a disruption of that scale deserved to be made whole." The wind came off the forest and moved through the walkway. She did not step back from it. "That is not an honest accounting of what you are," she said. He looked at her. "No," he said, "it is not." He was quiet for a moment. The night was enormous around them. Then he went down to one knee on the cold stone of the walkway. She had not seen it coming, and it was there before she could have prepared for it. He went down smoothly, and with complete intention, not a stumble, and not a performance, not a gesture, for anyone watching, because there was no one watching. It was simply the thing that was true in the moment, that required the true thing. The one honest gesture available to a person who had just said everything he had been carrying, and was now doing the only thing that felt equal to it. His head bowed for a moment, then he looked up. His face. She had been watching his face for 6 weeks, and she had seen every version of it. The public version in the throne hall, the careful version in the library, the surprised version in the paddock, the exhausted and open version in the moonlit yard. This version was the one underneath all of those. This was the version that had been there all along, behind all the other versions, the one that was his, in the way that the oldest things are only yours, the one that had no management in it, because it had been waiting too long for the management to feel worth maintaining. He was entirely open. Every part of him that he had spent years constructing a presentation for was simply there, looking at her, asking nothing, except to be seen accurately. She stood on the walkway and looked at him, and let it be exactly what it was. Then she reached out and placed her hand against the side of his face. His skin was warm. He closed his eyes the moment she touched him, completely, with the specific totality of someone who has been braced against the cold for a very long time and has felt warmth arrive. He leaned into her hand. Not a small, careful lean. A full one. The way Calm had leaned into her hand in the paddock, without any reservation, without any part of itself held back for safety. Because a living thing that is completely safe does not need to hold anything in reserve. She felt what he felt. She always felt what living things felt when they were near enough. What came from him in this moment was not simple. It was layered and enormous, and underneath all the specific things, the exhaustion and the relief, and the enormous releasing of something long held, was the oldest thing of all. Recognition. The specific piece of a nature that has found the one thing it was always oriented toward. The feeling of a compass needle that has been held away from its true direction for so long that the holder has forgotten the direction existed and has been released and swings home. She stood on the cold walkway and felt all of this arrive in her chest, and she received it with her hand steady against his face. "Get up," she said quietly. "Stand with me." He opened his eyes. He rose. He was very tall standing, and the stars were behind him, and the castle was below them, and the forest ran north to the edge of the visible world. He did not say anything. She did not say anything. They stood on the narrow walkway together in the cold night, and neither of them needed words for it, because the thing that was happening was not in the category of things that words improve. Below them in the inner yard, all 7 wolves had gathered. They were sitting in the frostlight with their faces turned upward, amber-eyed and patient and entirely certain, in the way animals are certain about things that are true. She thought about the horn in Ashvale, about Agnes at the stove, about the road through the tall trees and the carriage and the servants' corridor room and the view of the wall. She thought about the fox at the fence on the last morning and the wolf in the gap between the oaks. She thought about amber light below a pine tree on the first night, looking up, asking something. She thought about cold stone in a moonlit yard and a hand held in both of his, and breathing slowly until the thing that was hardest became manageable. She thought about what it meant to have walked all that distance to arrive exactly here. She looked at him. He was looking at the forest, and the side of his face that she could see was the open version, the true one, and it was going to be the one she looked at for the rest of her life. That thought arrived simply, and stayed simply. She turned back to the forest. He turned beside her. They stood together in the enormous winter night, and nothing about what they were was small. The court did not change all at once, and Alara had not expected it to. She understood how people changed their minds, because she had been waiting for people to change their minds about her for 22 years, and had learned the mechanics of it thoroughly. It happened the way rivers changed course, through sustained pressure applied consistently over a long enough period, and the timeline was set by the pressure and the resistance, and not by the preference of whoever was doing the applying. Some minds changed completely and permanently, and the people holding them were surprised afterward at how fully they had converted. Some changed partially, finding a point of accommodation that was not agreement, but was livable. Some never changed. You could not predict the distribution in advance, and you could not accelerate the timeline through wanting it to go faster, and the only available action was to continue doing the real things and let the river sort itself out. She had always been good at the sustained application of real things. The animal sanctuary came first, because it was the most straightforward, and because the results were observable in the specific way that makes them hard to argue with, which is the way where the thing that was broken is now functioning, and the function is visible to anyone who walks past it. She designed it in conversation with Dan Briggs, the menagerie handler, and with Pete, and with 2 junior staff members who had been showing up at the outer yard with questions since her 3rd week in the castle. The design was based on what she had read, and what she had practiced, and what the animals themselves told her through their behavior about what they needed, which was the most reliable input of the 3. The central principle was that the animal's own timeline drove the recovery, and not the institutional schedule. Everything else was downstream of that. Owen Drake organized the practical elements with the efficient energy of a man who has finally found a problem that fits his particular combination of skills, and the outer yard behind the east wall was rebuilt over 8 weeks, into something that had not existed in Valethorn before. Not a collection of cages, a space that moved the way recovery moved, which was slowly, and with the animal's own will leading. The results were clear within 3 weeks. An injured red kite that had been sitting in an enclosure refusing to eat for 6 months was eating on the 4th day of the new arrangement. A young boar with a damaged leg that no handler had managed to approach was allowing examination within 2 weeks. Things that had been static were moving. People came to see. First the practical ones, the kitchen staff and the stable hands, and the junior servants who had their own relationship with the animal life of the castle. Then the curious ones, the younger court members without significant positions to protect. Then Helen. Helen appeared at the outer fence one afternoon and stood watching for 20 minutes without speaking. She was there again 3 days later. And 3 days after that, on the 4th visit, Ilara walked to the fence and stood on the other side of it. Helen looked at her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she had been watching to see whether what she was observing was what it appeared to be. Ilara asked whether she had reached a conclusion. Helen said she had. She said it appeared to be exactly what it looked like. She said, in a smaller voice than her usual one, that this was less common than it should be. After that, Helen was different. Not warm exactly, not personal, but different in the way that a person is different when they have made a decision and are living with it honestly, rather than managing around it. She spoke to Ilara with the genuine courtesy she gave to people she respected, which was not the same as the managed courtesy she gave to everyone as a professional practice. The village work was harder and took longer and was more important than the sanctuary. She had asked to see the full correspondence between the castle and the southern settlements in November, and Owen had spent 3 weeks assembling it from 4 separate filing systems. She read all of it. She made notes. She wrote a 4-page document that was a plain factual accounting of what the correspondence showed when you looked at it all together, rather than in its separate administrative streams, which was that the system was functioning in a way that served the castle's requirements, and was not functioning in a way that served the villages that supplied the resources the castle required. She gave it to Aldrich over morning tea without explanation. He read it. He read all of it, and annotated it in the margins as he went, and the annotations were questions aimed at the center of what each section was showing. When he was done, he looked at her and said that 3 administrative bodies needed restructuring, and that Edmund Voss had organized 2 of them. She said yes to both. He said he wanted Owen to manage the restructuring, and he wanted her to work with Owen on it. She said yes. Owen received this with the focused, forward-leaning quality of someone handed the work they were built for. He organized the restructuring process with comprehensive thoroughness, and Ilara worked alongside him through every stage of it, through the objections from the 3 administrative figures whose positions were affected, and through the procedural friction generated by the 2 who were opposed, and through the interminable review processes that the one who was actively opposed managed to introduce into every stage. She worked through all of it without becoming angry, because anger was expensive, and she had better uses for the energy. By spring, the first results were visible in the villages. 2 southern settlements received physician visits that had not happened in 3 years. The western road was scheduled for pre-flooding maintenance. The school with the damaged roof received materials and labor from the castle's stores. The village delegation came in April, 9 representatives from 5 settlements, and she met them in a working room, rather than the throne hall, because a working room was where things got decided, rather than declared. She sat across the table from them and asked, directly and without preamble, what the gap between what the castle provided and what their communities needed actually looked like from their side. She wrote down what they said without qualifying or redirecting any of it. After 2 hours, she brought Aldrich in. Not announced, not formally introduced, not managed. She said she would like them to meet the person she had been working with on this. He sat at the table and listened more than he spoke, and when he spoke, asked the same quality of questions he asked her in the mornings, which was the questions that went toward the center of things. The delegation left with a different understanding of the castle than they had arrived with, and some of them would say later, in their own villages, that they had not expected to leave a meeting at Valethorn Castle, feeling that they had been heard rather than processed. The second full moon after the tower walkway night was the first one they sat through together in the inner yard, on the low stone bench near the east wall, without the castle locking down. She had suggested this to Aldrich 3 weeks before, and he had been quiet for a moment, and then said yes, and they had both understood what the yes meant, which was that the condition that had required the lockdown was not the same condition it had been before. She sat beside him on the bench, and the wolves gathered in their patient ring, and the moon came up, and the tide moved through him the way it always did, large and undeniable, and she breathed beside him, and he breathed alongside her, and it moved through to its peak, and came back down, and she was beside him the whole time. At the end of it, he sat on the bench in the inner yard, looking at the wolves. "Half as long," he said. "Yes," she said. "Because you were here. Because you were not alone in it." She looked at the wolves, who were beginning to disperse toward their usual nighttime positions, with the settled quality of animals whose work is done. The things that are hardest when they are only yours to carry. Shared. They still happen. They are just more endurable. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I have carried most things alone, for a very long time." "I know," she said. "I have too. We are both going to have to learn something about the alternative." He looked at her. The open face. The true one. There on the bench in the moonlit yard. "I am not certain I know how," he said. "Neither am I," she said. "That makes two of us learning at the same time, which is at least fair." The third full moon the shift was shorter again. The fourth was shorter still. By the sixth, the castle did not lock down. The full moon became, by the spring, an evening when Aldrich went quieter than his usual quiet, and wanted to be outside, and Alara went with him, because she found the moonlit castle beautiful from the inner yard, and the wolves gathered as they always did, and the night passed without anyone sealed inside their rooms. The discussion of her formal position moved the way the village restructuring had moved, which was through friction and objection, and procedural delay, and the sustained pressure of continued real results. Owen found the constitutional precedent in the historical records. It had been used twice before. The council debated it. The debate produced everything except a final no, because a final no required someone to stand in front of the full council and formally oppose what the castle's record now made very difficult to oppose, and none of the members who were privately opposed were willing to do that publicly. She and Aldrich talked about it one evening after the small dining room had emptied. He asked what she wanted, the actual question, the one that was about her rather than about what was most politically convenient. She told him. She wanted the work made permanent, the sanctuary and the village oversight, and the restructured administrative bodies, permanent and stable enough to continue independently of her personal position. She wanted a title that described what she was, rather than what historical category they could fit her into. She wanted the authority to walk into a village and do something about what she found there. He listened to all of it, and then he said, "And I want you here. Specifically you. Not the position or the work, though both are real. You. I have known this from the first week, and I have spent every week since then, finding the honesty to say it plainly." She looked at him. "Then I will be here," she said. Owen produced the precedent. The council accepted it. The preparations began. Iris managed her emotional response to the preparations on 2 separate occasions by becoming extremely efficient about adjacent tasks immediately afterward, which was her particular method, and which produced good results. Owen threw himself into the logistics, with the energy he brought to problems that engaged him. Helen took on the formal arrangements with the practiced thoroughness of someone who had been managing significant household events for a long time, and was doing this one with a slightly different investment. Alara designed the gown herself. Dark blue, the deep shade of the late evening sky that she had been watching from the east wing window every night. No high collar, nothing arranged on the left side. The scars exactly as they had always been. Silver white along her jaw and neck and collarbone, entirely visible, because she had never found a reason to apologize for them, and she was not finding one now. On the morning of the ceremony, she sat at the writing desk for an hour before she dressed. She wrote about everything from the horn in Ashvale to this morning, the full honest version, the version that was as accurate as she could make it, because that was the only version she had ever been interested in keeping. She dressed. She braided her hair with the usual care. She stood at the clear mirror and looked at herself completely, all of it, and said nothing, because everything the looking communicated was already said. The throne hall was full. Every court member. The village delegation along the right side, formally included for the first time in this castle's recorded history. The staff in their positions along the walls. Late winter light through the high windows laying bright stripes across the stone floor. She walked in through the main doors, and the hall went quiet. She walked its full length alone, with her chin level and her back straight, and her pace even. The pace she had walked out of Ashvale with, and into this castle with, and across every space in between, and the sound of her footsteps on the stone was the only sound in the hall. She reached the dais. She turned. She looked at the room. Every face, the changed ones and the unchanged ones and the ones still deciding, all of them. She looked at all of it without hurry. Aldrich came from the side door in dark clothes, without ornamentation, carrying the crown himself on its cushion. He had been specific about this. He climbed the dais and stood in front of her. He looked at her. The amber eyes in the candlelight were the amber they had always been, in every context, every hour, every version of every room they had shared. Consistent, present, containing nothing that was not true. He went down on one knee. The hall became the most complete version of silence available. He lifted the crown. He rose. He placed it on her head with his own hands, slowly and with certainty, and his hands were warm, and he stepped back and looked at her. She took his hand. They turned to face the hall together. From the right side, from the village delegation, someone began to applaud. One pair of hands, and then another. And then the sound spread the way things spread when they are real, not because of social obligation, but because people feel something and decide not to contain it. It moved across the hall. It was large and genuine, and it was hers. He leaned toward her, close enough that only she could hear. "Are you all right?" he said. She stood in the throne hall of Valethorn, with the crown on her head, and her scars exactly where they had always been, and her hand in the hand of the person who had looked at the full truth of her, and recognized it as exactly what it was. She turned to look at him. "Yes," she said, and meant it with everything she was. Outside, in the frost light of the inner yard, the wolves sat with their faces turned toward the high windows of the hall, patient and certain and amber-eyed, as they had been since the beginning. The forest ran north to the edge of all visible things and beyond. A woman the world had decided to discard was standing in the center of the world that found her. A king who had knelt before no one, had knelt before the one person who had ever simply come toward him and stayed. And what they had built between them was not a story about what had been given or taken back. It was the story of what happens when two people who have spent their whole lives being looked at without being seen, finally look at each other, and see, and stay.